Hey everybody, thanks for checking out Community Christian Church Online. You are in the right place because CCC is all about helping people find their way back to God. And today we're continuing a series called Rooted, and it's about developing a solid foundation of faith. You know, we need the roots of our spiritual lives to go deep and wide if we're going to thrive. And this series explores how we can invest our energy in developing a faith that is rooted in God's truth. And if you've missed a week, you got to get caught up. And you can do that by heading to communitycc.net or over to CCC's YouTube page. And I hope this service is exactly what you need today. You know, in fact, I hope it's the highlight of your week.
Fingers bleed. See the darkness tremble at the ground below his feet. In the darkest hour, in the valley low, I will fear no evil. 'Cause you'll never let me go. You'll never let me go. So come out into the waters. Come let the broken sing. Come all your sons and daughters. His love changes everything. So come when the fear is hiding. You're finding the risen King. Come on and let the light in. Your love changes everything, and I can overcome when death has lost its sting. Your love, your love, your love changes everything, but none can overcome when death has lost its sting. Your love, your love, your love changes everything. Come on into the waters, come let the broken sing. Come all your sons and daughters, his love changes everything. So come when the fear is fighting, you're finding the risen King. Come on and let the light in, your love changes everything. So come out into the waters, come let the broken sing. Come all your sons and daughters, his love changes everything. So come when the fear is fighting, you're finding the risen King. Come on and let the light in. Your love changes everything. Your love, your love, your love changes everything. Your love, your love, your love changes everything.
Welcome to Community Christian Church Online, where we are all about helping people find the way back to God. My name is Nick Cox, and I'm really glad to be here today. We're in the midst of a series called Rooted, where we've been talking about the deep things of our spiritual lives and our faith in God. We've been looking at some of the essentials of what it looks like to live out a deeply rooted Christian faith. You'll see lists online all the time when you're scrolling around. I'm guessing people must click on these because they're kind of all over the place. They're, like top 5 lists, things like, top 5 essentials for your wardrobe for winter, or 5 essential ways to increase customer satisfaction, and 8 essential places to visit in Kansas City, and 10 essential things to do with your new puppy. They're all over the place. You know what I mean? And I came across one the other day, and it was 5 essential favors for fall that aren't pumpkin spice, right? So 5 flavors for fall that aren't pumpkin spice. All right. So you ready for this? Number 5 is apple. Totally can get behind that, right? It makes sense. Apple cider, apple pie. You got apple festivals, apple picking. Totally there with that. 4 is salted caramel, which now we're talking, right? I have a bit of a sweet tooth, and then you mix 4 and 5 together, you get a good salted caramel apple. Yes, sir. That sounds good to me. Number 3 is radicchio. And I don't know about you, but I had to Google to see what radicchio is. It's a type of red cabbage. I'm not sure if that made your list. I don't think it would have made my list. Number 2 is pear, which I guess we already have apples. I don't necessarily need another fruit there, but whatever. It's not radicchio. And number 1 is cinnamon. So you kind of brought it back around strong. I think cinnamon's a real strong kind of fall flavor. I think there's a reason lists like that are so much fun, because it's nice to have this large topic kind of boiled down to its core. What are the top things? That's kind of what this series has been all about when it comes to our faith. What are the essentials, the deep roots of what we believe? And what I'm going to talk about today is one of those deeply rooted essentials of the Christian faith, but I don't think it's one we pay quite as much attention to. Our world and our culture doesn't celebrate it. Our own minds rebel against it. I want to take some time today to talk about humility. Humility, I think most of us would say, is a virtue. If you were going to make a top 10 list of virtues a person could work toward, I bet humility would make a lot of people's list. But we have to understand that in the ancient world, this simply wasn't the case. Humility simply was not a virtue in the Greco and Roman ethic. In fact, the word used for humility literally meant something like to be crushed or to be debased. It was associated with failure and shame. The way we talk about humility just did not exist as a positive thing in the ancient world. It was something to be avoided. They thought humility of the same way we kind of think about humiliation. And I don't know many people who go out of their way to experience humiliation. There's a collection of writings called the Delphonic Canon from the 6th century BC, and it's considered to be kind of like this ancient Greek sum and substance of ethical life. It's kind of like a ethical textbook for ancient Greeks. There's absolutely no mention of humility, let alone the actual word of humility. In its place was philotimia. Philotimia. It's the love of honor. Aristotle, he insisted that honor and reputation are among the pleasantest things that one could contemplate and attain for oneself. And the logic, of course, makes sense. If you achieve great things, it only makes sense that you would get recognition for it. Achievement deserves public praise. Success deserves receiving public honor. It's not that the people of the ancient world were never humble. They would talk about maybe being humble before their gods because they thought, the gods could kill you. And humility was probably advisable before an emperor, largely for the same reason, they could have you executed. But humility before an equal? That wasn't something desirable. Humility toward a lesser person was absolutely unthinkable. It upset the assumed equation that merit demanded honor. So therefore, honor was proof of merit, kind of the transitive property there. Avoiding honor implied a diminishment of merit. It was seen as shameful. But taking hold of honor due to the merit or abilities of victory was perfectly acceptable. It was taken for granted that those with merit would seek honor due to them. That was the philotimata. This is the world in which Jesus was born and lived and taught, as he was teaching from a very different mindset and from a very different context. When you look at the person of Jesus and read his teachings, you'll see something completely different. Jesus taught how the poor in spirit were blessed, for theirs was going to be the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And to love your enemies. If someone strikes your right cheek, turn to him the other one also. On another occasion, Jesus seems to delight in kind of turning upside down this ancient notion of greatness and servitude. And Jesus' followers, they were busy having an argument about which one of them was the greatest, which one deserved the most honor, to be seated at his right hand and his left hand, which were places of distinction. And Jesus flips the whole thing over and says, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Over and over, Jesus points not to the gaining of honor, but to what things are held in honor in the kingdom of heaven. But perhaps nothing highlights Christian humility more than Jesus' execution on the cross. Crucifixion was the ancient world's ultimate punishment. It was reserved for political rebels and slaves, people who were viewed as just kind of the lowest of the lows. There was 3 official forms of capital punishment in the ancient world: crucifixion, decapitation, and being burned alive. And crucifixion was regarded as the most shameful and the most brutal, the most humiliating. Victims were usually scourged with a leather strap. They were stripped naked. They were led to a public place. They were nailed to a large wooden beam where they would endure for hours, sometimes days. Just this ultimate humiliating death. And this is the death that the followers of Jesus saw their master face. The greatest man they had ever known was brought down to the lowest place the Roman world could envision: death by crucifixion. Jesus, through his crucifixion, was forcing his followers, both then and now, to rethink the entire honor-shame paradigm. Ancient Mediterranean cultures pursued honor and avoided shame at all costs. Honor was proof of merit. Shame was proof of worthlessness. But what does this say about a crucified Jesus? That was the question confronting early Christians and the ancient world. And it continues to be a question that everyone that encounters Jesus must face. This great contradiction between the Son of God, the all-powerful, the mighty one, killed shamefully and disgracefully and in humiliation on a brutal Roman cross. Logically, they had kind of 2 options. Either Jesus was not as great as they first thought, that he was less than he claimed to be, and that crucifixion was evidence of his insignificance, or the very notion of greatness and honor and glory itself had to be redefined to fit with the fact of this seemingly shameful end. And you can tell there are people in the early church that are wrestling with this dynamic. The Apostle Paul wrote in the Bible to help people understand this new definition of humility, and choosing to think of others better than themselves. And then he drives the point home by quoting a hymn, a song, presumably one that would have been sung in this church he was writing to in Philippi, that addresses Jesus' humiliation on the cross. This is what he writes: "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourself. Each of you should look not to your own interest, but also to the interest of others. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who being the very nature of God did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself and even became obedient to death, even death on a cross." What Paul is writing here is a humility revolution. In no time in history was humility elevated in this way. Honor and shame are turned on their heads. The highly honored Jesus lowered himself to a shameful cross, and yet, in so doing, became an object not of scorn, but of worship and emulation. In humility, consider others better than yourself. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ. Honor has been redefined, greatness recast. If the greatest man that has ever known chose to forego his status for the good of others' greatness, it must consist of humble service of all those who follow after him. The shameful place is now a place of honor. The low point is the high point. And you might rightfully wonder, why would we talk about humility in a series about these deeply rooted aspects of our faith? And it's because you cannot understand Christian faith apart from understanding that Jesus himself lowered himself to the deepest depths for us. And we are called, as an act of worship and identification with Jesus, to do the same thing. And I worry that our world and our culture pulls us in different directions. And I worry, if I'm being really honest, that the current expression of Christianity often forgets that we are called to emulate Jesus in our humility. I think humility is probably the greatest virtue needed in our world today. It has never been easier to become more self-obsessed, self-focused than right now. One of the early church fathers, John Chrysostom, once wrote, "Humility is the root, mother, nurse, foundation, and bond of all virtue." He meant that it's what all the other virtues are built upon. Without humility, there is no love. There's no forgiveness. There's no courage. or any other virtue. Without humility, they simply become mirages of what they were always meant to be. After all, it is the character quality that we learn most from our Savior Jesus, that he came to earth. For you think about that, the one person who ever lived who did not need to be humble is the one person who exemplifies humility for all of us. And if a Christian is a follower of Jesus, we need to expect that we would follow him in humility as well. But if we're going to get really good at this humility thing, if we're going to get it kind of deep in our lives, then we have to be really, really clear about what humility is and what it isn't. I think it's possible that some people have been taught or believe some challenging views about humility. First of all, let's take a moment to think about what humility is not. We have to understand that humility is not about denying the gifts, abilities, or talents that we have. I have no doubt that everyone that is listening to this is uniquely gifted by God. Humility is not denying that God has made you the way that he made you. This is not about a smart person pretending that they're dumb or an athletic person pretending that they're clumsy. Actually, if you're pretending to be less than you are, you're probably not using your gifts or your experiences the way God has called you to. Secondly, humility does not mean that you have to be a doormat to abuse. In seeking to be humble, we never say, well, I guess I'm supposed to be lowly, so if someone wants to take advantage of me, I'll just let them. That's not humility. Now, humility might turn the other cheek, but that doesn't take away the pain of the hit, and it doesn't make the hit okay. Humility isn't about hating who you are or how you look or anything about yourself. It's not about believing you deserve to be treated poorly because you do not. Finally, humility isn't about having a lack of direction or desire or ambition. You can be a leader and be humble. In fact, humility is an excellent trait for a leader. It means that when you voice your opinion when someone asks for it, it means asking questions, admitting to failures, seeking help when you don't know how to do something. A humble leader acts with integrity and seeks the good of all people, which often, especially for a follower of Jesus, requires us to go against the flow. And I don't know about you, but I think a lot of us would love to work for a boss like that. But there's a counterforce to humility that pushes back against our desire to move toward humility, and that's pride. I want you to think about it this way. Imagine that there's a part inside of you, like a body part where pride resides, and we'll call it ego. And pride, playing itself out inside of our ego, it's a really tricky thing. And one thing we need to know about ego is that ego is empty. There's this emptiness at the center of human ego, right? The way that we talk about ego getting puffed up or egos getting deflated, right? It's very clear that it's there's nothing at the center of it. It's like a balloon. And we will be tempted to build our identity around something other than God, meaning that we are living the illusion that we can be competent in running our lives, that we can achieve a sense of self-worth within ourselves, that we can find purpose big enough that we can manage our life without God. And the normal human ego will be built on something, and often it's a temptation to build it on something beside God. See, we're all searching for something that will give a sense of worth, a sense of specialness, a sense of purpose, and we build ourselves on that. Of course, if you try to put something in the middle of that place designed for God, it's going to be too small. It's going to rattle around inside of there. I think we can feel it, that rattling, that knowing that we're filling ourselves with something that's just not big enough, which means that ego is painful. An overinflated ego is painful. Our body physically kind of draws attention when we're hurt. It appears our egos are hurt all the time because it constantly tries to draw attention to itself. It's always drawing attention, concerned about how we look, how we're treated, what we're owed, what we deserve. Every time our ego takes a hit, it hurts. It's terribly hard to go throughout a day without my ego being hurt or feeling bruised or feeling slighted in some way or another, even just feeling embarrassed. And so we need to constantly address the pain of our egos, defending ourselves and our worth and our value, because like a balloon, we can't let that ego deflate, which means our ego is really busy. Our ego is never happy. It's always drawing attention to itself. It's incredibly busy trying to fill the emptiness. Paul, who we were talking about before, he writes this letter to this church at Corinth about how the people are constantly trying to puff themselves up. And they're very concerned about comparing themselves to other people and boasting. The natural position of my ego as we deal with its emptiness and pain is to compare ourselves with other people all the time. You see, pride, particularly when it plays out in our ego, is by nature competitive. Pride gets no pleasure out of having something, just having more of it than someone else. You might get the impression that someone is really proud of being rich or smart or attractive, But it's not really the case. They're proud because they are richer, smarter, better looking than someone else. We know this because when we are in the presence of a person who has more than we have, sometimes we lose the pleasure in what we have. You see this all the time with kids, right? I have 3 kids, 12, 10, and 7. And let's say that I serve my kids ice cream, right? Scoop some ice cream out, throw some chocolate syrup on it, maybe some whipped cream and some sprinkles. Sound good, right? What's the first thing they do? Do they just enjoy it? Are they deeply thankful? Are they just effusive with their praise of my ice cream preparation prowess? Nope. They look at the other 2 bowls to make sure no one has more than they do. And heaven forbid one of the bowls has more than the others. They immediately cease to enjoy what they have and instead focus on what they don't have. Whether we like it or not, humans are comparative in nature, and our ego, that busy, hollow, painful thing that it is, rarely finds pleasure in a thing itself, only in being better and more than someone else, which makes ego very fragile. Not only is our ego empty, not only is it painful, not only is it busy, our ego is fragile. Again, think about a balloon. When a balloon is inflated, it's much more susceptible to popping. And so our ego tends to bounce back and forth between being overinflated, being deflated, continuously moving between those 2 states, neither of which God intends for us, and neither of which feels very good at all. So how do I take this painful, busy, fragile body part of mine and turn it into like an appendix, like this organ I don't even care about, I don't even notice. In fact, you can take it out and I wouldn't even need it. How do we get there? Again, the Apostle Paul deeply understood Christian humility that we've been talking about, and he wants to make sure that other followers of Jesus understand it too. Now, let's take a look again at Paul's writing, and this is in the book of 1 Corinthians, and we're going to be in chapter 4. This is what Paul writes. I care very little if I am judged by you or by any human court. Indeed, I do not even judge myself. My conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. It is the Lord who judged me. So, one of the ways we develop Christian humility and combat against pride is by recognizing where our identity comes from. Paul knows that he is a man of many flaws. However, this is not the point. His sins and his identity are not connected. He does not play that game. He does not see a sin and let it destroy his sense of identity. He will not make the connection. Neither will Paul connect an accomplishment to his identity. He sees all kinds of sins and accomplishments within himself, but he refuses to connect them with who he is. This isn't about pretending that they're not there. It's about refusing to allow either of them frame who he is. His sin is not going to stop the things that he has been called to do, neither will his victories. And Paul says, I don't care what you think. In fact, I don't care what I think. His ego is not puffed up. Instead, he is filled up with his purpose and identity in God. And this is the true expression of humility. Paul is reaching a place where his ego is no longer drawing attention to itself, no longer demanding to be inflated or demanding the spotlight. C.S. Lewis, he puts it so beautifully when he writes this. The thing we would remember from meeting a truly gospel-centered person is that they would be totally interested in us. Because the essence of gospel humility is not thinking more of myself or less of myself. It is thinking of myself less. And that's the real secret of Christian humility. It's not about thinking about myself as less than other people. It's about thinking about myself less often. Tim Keller wrote a beautiful little book, and it's called The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness. Humility, true Christian humility, leads to the freedom of self-forgetfulness, the freedom of not having to literally or metaphorically keep checking in the mirror to see how I'm doing, to how am I measuring up, monitoring the inflation level of my ego. You see, the problem with ego and the concept of self-esteem is that whether it's our self-esteem is high or our self-esteem is low, every single day and every single interaction becomes a courtroom. How am I doing today? How am I measuring up? How's my performance? And so we constantly have to ask questions and measure ourselves. And it's just a misery. I can't live up to my parents' standards, and that kind of makes me feel terrible. And I can't live up to your standards, and that makes me feel kind of terrible. And I can't live up to social media standards, and that makes me feel kind of terrible. Perhaps the solution is make my own standards, but I can't keep them either. I guess I can make my standards really, really low, but then I feel kind of terrible because I realize I'm the kind of person who has to set really, really low standards. I hope you can see this for the trap that it is. It doesn't work and it never will. Every day we are constantly under review. And this is the beautiful freedom Jesus offers us, and it's the beautiful freedom Paul is writing about. What Paul is saying is that the outcome, the verdict, it comes before the performance. The outcome is already determined. I'm a child of God who has been fully adopted into the family of God. That's the verdict, and it's already in. For Paul and for us, this is the freedom of humility. It is the freedom of not having to measure to some artificial standard because the verdict is already in. Can you imagine how freeing it would be to not have to worry about what other people think or even what you think about yourself? Paul knows that other people's judgments can't be trusted. He knows his own judgment can't be trusted. So what does he trust? The judgment of God. You see, the verdict is in, and God loves you, and he accepts you, and he longs to adopt you. That's already settled. And now, I perform on the basis of that verdict, on the basis of that conclusion, not to earn it, but because it already is there, it already exists. Because he loves me, and he accepts me. And I do not have to do the things to build up my resume. I don't have to do the things that make me look good. I can do the things for the joy of them because God has called me to do them. I can help people, not so that I feel better about myself, not so that I can fill up some emptiness of my ego or to create a larger gap between myself and whoever I'm comparing to. No, because it's what God's called my life to. And in light of God's love in my life, there is true freedom. The Christian humility we are called to, this beautiful freedom of self-forgetfulness, is not needing to think about myself so much, not needing to connect things to myself. It is an end of thoughts like, I'm in a room with these people. Does that make me look good? How do they see me? Am I attractive enough? Am I smart enough? Am I impressive enough? Do I even want to be here? Truly gospel-centered humility means I can stop connecting every experience and every conversation with myself. In fact, I can stop thinking about myself so much. The freedom of self-forgetfulness, the blessed rest that only self-forgetfulness brings, is that deep humility. In the book of James in the Bible, we read that God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And that word grace in Greek is the word charis. And what it means in Greek is the things that bring joy and pleasure and delight and sweetness and charm and loveliness. I think in a very real way, when we are humble, when we have found this amazing freedom of self-forgetfulness, that sort of grace and the joy and the delight and the freedom it brings is exactly what God offers us. I want to challenge us to remember that we are playing a game that's already been won. If you were an athlete and you knew that the game was already won, imagine the freedom that might evoke, the boldness you could play with, the joy you could experience when the stress of winning or removing it's just winning or losing is gone. It's already won. You woke up today and the game was already won. The verdict is already in. What would you do if it really didn't matter what other people thought about you? What would you do if it really didn't need to be proven right? What would you do if your opinion didn't need to be better than someone else's opinion? Who would you serve and love and care for if you were freed to do so with a bold abandon? What would happen if all the mirrors in your house just stopped working? If you were free to remember that God already adopted you and there was nothing you could do to earn it and there was nothing you could do to disqualify yourself from it, what would you do in light of that freedom? One of the places I might recommend is paying attention to the times when your focus turns toward yourself. In the midst of a conversation, how often do you find that you shift the topic onto yourself? How often are you paying attention to what other people are saying? And how often are you worried about how you might be perceived? How often is it about you? And then you have to ask, what part of me is this feeding? Am I lonely? Am I insecure? Do I feel the need to be impressive, to look strong? Am I being fearful? What am I seeking from this moment that this interaction is feeding? Because if I deeply know the part of myself that these moments are feeding, then I can ask where I need God to turn my focus and attention to Him. That He can turn my view to Him and what He means in my life, the identity He has given to me. And then pray to God to remind you of the freedom you have in Him, the freedom to release yourself from judgment to others, the freedom to release yourself from judgment from yourself because of the identity found in Jesus. For some people, this is exactly what the act of worship does for them. It's a chance to set aside some time and to be reminded to turn our eyes to God, the great freedom we have in Jesus, the songs, the teaching, the connection with other followers of Jesus, it gives us an opportunity to set aside our egos, to be reminded of the amazing freedom of self-forgetfulness. It's also one of the powerful reminders we have in communion. In communion, we remember the sacrifice of Jesus made on the cross, the humiliating death of the all-powerful God that sets us free and that tosses on its head the need to chase our own honor. We're going to take some time to celebrate communion. It's where we eat a piece of bread and we drink some juice to remember the body and the blood of Jesus and the sacrifice that he made for us on the humiliation of the cross, and it sets us free. And I hope that we can find our identity fully in him.
Is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly trust in Jesus' name. Is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly trust in Jesus' name. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. When darkness seems to hide His face, I rest on His unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. My anchor holds within the veil. He is welcome with trumpet sound. Oh, may I then in him be found, dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne.
Thanks again for tuning in to CCC's online service. And if you want to financially support CCC's mission of helping people find their way back to God, you can give online at communitycc.net. Thank you so much for your continued faithfulness and generosity towards what God is doing in our community. You know, our faith is designed to be experienced together in community. And the best way to experience that is by joining us in person. If you have any questions about what it's like in person at CCC, you can plan your visit at our website. There you get an idea of what to expect, and if you have kids, you can even pre-register them to help streamline some things when you arrive on Sunday. I hope this service was the highlight of your week. We'll see you next time with the next installment of Rooted. Thanks.